Good morning, good afternoon. This is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. And we hope that this Monday morning finds you healthy and safe and doing as well as possible under the current circumstances. We're pleased to be able to reconvene our second webinar in the Critical Minerals and the Energy Transition webinar series that the Institute of the Americas has launched and is co-hosting with the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. For many of you, we apologize for a bit of an issue last week, but we're delighted to be able to reconvene and hopefully go through this entire presentation. Just quickly, for those who may not at this point still know, we use the chat function for the questions during the Q&A period. So we'll have a brief set of introductory remarks from myself and Morgan Bazillion at the Payne Institute, and then we'll throw it over to our colleagues at the U.S. Department of State, the Bureau of Energy Resources, who will deliver the formal presentation on the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end of the formal presentation. But just a reminder, you do not need to wait until the formal presentation or the remarks are concluded. You can pose questions using the chat function anytime during the course of the presentation. So feel free to jump in and pose a question or make a comment. I think I mentioned last week that we were delighted in our first installment of this energy webinar series together with the Payne Institute, how active folks were on the chat function. There was just as much back and forth amongst participants seemingly as there were questions for our guests. So we encourage that. That's great. No problem at all. Go back and forth. This is hopefully a virtual platform that encourages discussion and dynamic dialogue. Similarly, in our first installment of the webinar series, we talked a little bit about some policy developments, and there were some questions and conversation around what government can do in the realm of critical minerals. And so we're very pleased to now turn to the State Department and the Bureau of Energy Resources to hear exactly what one such initiative is, as they call it, ERGI, the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, and we'll get into further detail. But let me first ask Morgan Bazillion to say a couple of remarks before we invite our colleagues at the State Department. Morgan, thanks again for your support and the Payne Institute's collaboration on this.
Jeremy, thank you so much. We are honored to be co-hosting the series on critical minerals with the Institute for the Americas. My name's Morgan Bazillion. I'm director of the Payne Institute at the Colorado School of Mines. Thank you to everyone joining us, and we have a great webinar today. And mostly thank you to the tremendous team at State who is really leading the way on this topic from a diplomatic perspective. We're grateful for their time and looking forward to hearing about their ERGI initiative. And thank you all again, and hopefully you'll find some of our other webinars in the series useful as well. Thanks.
And thank you, Morgan, for that segue. I probably was remiss in not mentioning. So here's a list on the screen of our upcoming, and indeed this week, this Thursday, we have one more installment of that webinar series together with Payne. Then the Institute's doing a couple of other programs. And for those of you who are very familiar with the La Jolla Energy Conference, well, it's going to be virtual this year. So over the course of a week, we'll deliver the La Jolla Conference, the 29th annual, first ever virtual La Jolla Conference. So mark your calendars. Most importantly, this Thursday, April 23rd, 10 a.m. California time. And then we've got a couple other webinars coming up, one more in this series, and then the La Jolla Conference. So, and of course, final announcement from our side, follow us on social media. That's the best way to keep up to date on what we're doing in terms of webinars and all kinds of programs, reports, etc. So let me throw it now over, and I'll introduce Mark Pituch, who's the Energy Officer at the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State, who will begin the presentation, and then he will invite his colleagues to weigh in as well as they work through the course of their formal remarks. And again, don't hesitate, fire some questions via the chat function, and we'll get to those at the end. So Mark and team, thank you all again for your support and participation in this. We think this is an important topic, and we're delighted to have you sharing it with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. This is Mark Pituch, and I'm an energy officer at the Bureau of Energy Resources at the State Department. So first of all, I wanted to thank Jeremy and the Institute of the Americas very much for having us. We really, really appreciate it. And also to Morgan at the Payne Institute. Morgan has been a great, great resource and a great ally for us as we've been doing this work. So really, really appreciate both of your support. And also thanks to everyone tuning into this webinar for taking some time out of your day to hear about the Energy Resource Governance Initiative, or ERGI as we call it. Most people's minds are completely dominated, rightly, by the continuing COVID-19 crisis, but we really appreciate your interest in this unique initiative. And one thing that this crisis is highlighting is that global supply chains, as necessary as they are, also need to be diverse and resilient. So we hope that we're doing a little bit in our part in creating an environment for more diverse and more resilient energy supply chains. In that vein, I wanted to start off our presentation today by saying a few words about what guided our thinking in creating ERGI, beyond the fact that we're all from the government and get a substantial bonus if we create a new acronym. So all of us on this webinar work for the State Department's Bureau of Energy Resources, all of us representing. And the State Department, as you know, guides U.S. Foreign policy. And then within state, the Bureau of Energy Resources, or ENR, as we call it, that's another acronym, leads America's engagements in energy diplomacy. ENR operates at the critical intersection between energy and U.S. national security and ensures U.S. leadership on global energy issues. Specifically, ENR works on the energy security of the United States, its partners and allies, by supporting the diversification of energy sources, supplies from all sources of energy, and routes, and reducing barriers to energy trade and development by promoting open, transparent, and market-based energy sectors to advance U.S. economic interests. So if we could go to the next slide, please. One of the things that we try to do a good job of within ENR is identifying new trends that will shape the future of energy markets and energy diplomacy. And one of the biggest trends that we've been following very closely is the increased deployment of clean energy technologies, especially batteries for electric vehicles or for storing electricity for later use, either on the grid or through microgrids or in commercial or residential applications. In our analysis, we found that battery technologies are especially minerals intensive and are forecast by a number of leading international organizations create enormous demand for critical energy minerals. Critical energy minerals is a phrase that we use a lot, and what we mean by that is the lithium, the cobalt, the nickel, graphite, rare earths, and other minerals and metals that go into clean energy technologies such as batteries or even wind turbines or solar panels. We expect there to be an exponential increase in demand in the coming years for critical energy minerals, and we are very excited to see this new opportunity in energy markets. If we could go to the next slide, please. Aware of this impending challenge and in response to the issue of critical minerals generally, the administration issued an executive order on critical minerals last year. Though it addressed the issue of critical minerals broadly, energy minerals are a very important subset of it. The executive order was mainly meant to stimulate the domestic mining sector, but as we know, the United States cannot solve this problem alone. So there is a specific portion of the order that is dedicated to international cooperation, and that's where the State Department comes in. What we are seeing play out now is that some of the countries that have the best concentrations of critical energy minerals cannot, for one reason or another, attract private investment. These countries either lack the regulatory or governance framework or the right investment climate to fully leverage their resources for their economic growth and the benefit of their people. In response to this issue, the governments of Australia, Botswana, Canada, Peru, and the United States founded the Energy Resource Governance Initiative. And what we're trying to do with the initiative is to promote best practices across the international mining sector. First and foremost, ERGI aims to start a dialogue about extractives, regulatory, and governance frameworks and investment climate. We have achieved that through leveraging bigger international gatherings to host ERGI convening meetings in which we discussed how countries could come together to help each other. Ultimately, we would like to affect above ground conditions to level the playing field, support capacity building through targeted technical support, and develop partnerships with like-minded countries with strong records of responsible mining. The first really tangible manifestation of our work and our cooperation is our online toolkit, free and open to anyone at www.ergi.tools. Again, that URL is www.ergi.tools. And it's a tremendous resource for anyone interested in the governance and regulation of the extractive sector. To give an introduction of the toolkit, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Helena Matza, Senior Advisor to the Bureau of Energy Resources Front Office and one of the driving forces behind this initiative. Helena?
Thank you so much, Mark. Really appreciate that introduction. As Mark mentioned, ERGI is first and foremost designed to serve as a mechanism to improve energy mineral sector governance and to promote resilient and diverse energy mineral supply chains. Really, one of the first steps we wanted to take after bringing our partners together to achieving that goal was to design an accessible web-based platform to start sharing some of those best practices. So what you see in front of you is how we started organizing ourselves. As many of you know, there are several really successful organizations out there that have done great work in creating standards and criteria for sustainable mining practices. Our goal here was to pull from the existing world of international best practice and share that information through a combination of interactive tools and case studies. The interactive section of this toolkit was designed to provide government officials with decision-making tools that would help them weigh the various trade-offs and opportunities available to them when they're evaluating policy questions and determining the overall return on investment for the various stakeholders in their decision-making process, from government to the private sector to local stakeholders, all of those that are affected by mining activities. The second component of the toolkit includes illustrative case studies provided by our founding partners, representing mining sector successes and learning experiences from 4 different continents. We look forward to seeing this section of the toolkit grow in future iterations and continuing to learn from each other. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a little bit of a snapshot of what ERGI.tools looks like. The homepage was really designed and the toolkit overall was organized to mirror the decision-making process through the entire mine cycle development process. The idea was to build out modules related to 4 core areas. As you see here, resource management, so taking a look at how governments collect and share mineral data, what they consider when they're developing a geological survey, etc. Next bucket around project development, looking at issues around how mineral licenses are awarded, the trade-offs on different types of ownership models. Production. This is developing a set of tools related to issues and questions around mineral asset classification, royalty structures, fiscal regimes, and of course, accounting. And then lastly, but certainly not least, and you see it kind of across the whole mining lifecycle process, or lifecycle, excuse me, is around stewardship. So really developing tools around key important issues like social license to operate, environmental stewardship, localization, and workforce development. For the initial launch in early March, we developed 1 module under each of these core categories. My colleague Jenna will now take the floor to walk you through each one of our currently available tools. Jenna, over to you.
thank you for changing the slide. So starting with the first stage of the life cycle, resource management, we created a tool on understanding and promoting your resource endowment. The desire for this tool came about under some of the work myself and my colleagues have done around the world with national geological surveys in developing countries. Often these surveys were created for a mission that at the time was important, but maybe isn't so relevant right now. For example, in one country, their geological survey was established to help monitor lightning strikes on cattle. So in terms of capacity building, how do you get that kind of institution to start thinking about what they would need to do to attract investment into their mineral sector? A mineral sector they might not actually have been really working on or staffed systematically. We want to help the users in country think about what their priorities should be for designing their updated survey. What is expected of them by investors? Where should a national survey be located? In a university, in a ministry, as a standalone entity? Where can they get the most bang for the buck in the short term? And what are some long-term activities that might take longer to plan for? So this is how we designed this first tool. And you can see here on the bottom right, we've highlighted one of the sample interactive features, which lets the user intuitively understand these impacts and trade-offs from the different survey activities they can pursue. Next slide, please. Next, under the project development phase, under the project development stage, we have our first tool on mineral licenses and leasing. This tool is meant to lead the user through understanding the different kinds of mineral assets, surface versus subsurface rights, the different stakeholders who are involved in the mineral leasing process, private landowners, national governments, and subnational governments, which are really important in places like Canada or Argentina, countries that have really strong federalist systems. And then most importantly, how each of these stakeholders views and prioritizes changes in the mineral leasing process, depending on who is in charge. So you can see here for our interactive element, we let the user toggle between these users at the top. And you can see how the stakeholder map and relative influence of each user changes depending on who is, quote unquote, in charge of the leasing process. This tool also has a submodule on understanding the differences between open access and competitive resource tenders. Right now, the competitive section is fleshed out, and we're working on finishing up the open access portion as well. We cover but steer away pretty quickly from direct negotiation as a tactic because it often results in suboptimal outcomes for the government. Especially in developing contexts, there's usually negotiating from an inferior position that isn't informed by the best data. They don't have lawyers who have spent 20 years on these things like companies do, et cetera. Again, the idea here is capacity building from the point of view of the government. What do they need to know about what is expected of them and their role in this process? And how can they facilitate to get the very best outcomes for their country? Next slide, please. Next, under the production stage, we have a tool about two very important concepts: mineral asset classification and royalties. Mineral asset classification is one of these things a lot of people outside the sector mix up. They use words like resources and reserves interchangeably, but we know that these are actually really important distinctions to get right. Resources are what's in the ground, and reserves are what can be economically extracted from the ground, taking into account above ground conditions like royalty regimes and market pricing. So there's some learning on this. And then we move into what is a more critical element from the perspective of the government, and that is, what is my role in helping move resources into reserves? Some might say that this is predominantly a private sector activity, and it is to a degree, but the host governments need to understand their role, what is expected of them, understand the whole process, et cetera. This ties into the tool on national geological surveys that we previously discussed, because obviously geological work that is done to develop resources and move them into reserves would likely be part of an activity undertaken by a survey, and in part supervised by survey employees potentially. This transitions into what will likely be a standalone tool in the next version of the toolkit, and it's an introduction to royalty systems. This is something that is very much within the purview of the host government and something which dramatically affects whether or not those resources become reserves. This is an area where, especially in developing contexts, there's often a big push to get the most money up front, have very high royalty rates, in other words. This often isn't the best move though, and what we've tried to do here with this interactive element is show that, yes, you might get a lot of revenue up front, but with this kind of structure, maybe you're disincentivizing the mining operator from going after those lower quality assets, so the mine operating life is shorter than it would have been, and across the whole life cycle, you, the government, might make less money. And so this interactive element allows the user to click through many of these options and intuitively understand these trade-offs. Next slide, please. And finally, while we're covering stewardship last, as we mentioned before, we really see this as something that underpins all of the other mining lifecycle stages, which is why on the website, you'll see it's underneath all of the other stages. It underpins them all. The first tool we've chosen to cover here is the one we hear the most about, and you do probably too. It's social license to operate. This is a huge issue in the mining industry, probably the most important. Deloitte runs an annual survey of mining CEOs and COOs and releases a report every year called Tracking the Trends. And this concept, the idea of the social investor, is #1 this year, and I think has been for a while now. The ongoing consent of your local community can make or break your ability to operate. On this side, Helene and I have actually seen this firsthand in some of the work we've done. You can have mines literally side by side in really the same community. And if you've taken the time to interact with the community ahead of time, heard their concerns continually, and this is key, this is not a one and done kind of thing, like it has been under past traditional models of corporate social responsibility, perhaps, but continually take the time to understand what the community needs and provide that communication up front, you will have better outcomes. Finding these areas of mutual overlapping interest is key. In one mine in Peru we visited, the company needed water for their operations, and the community also needed cleaner drinking water. So they built a water treatment facility. Not only does the mine get the water they need to operate, the community now has clean water for the first time ever. Cases of childhood illness have dropped, school attendance has gone up. This is what we would call a value beyond compliance. Mining operators increasingly have to understand that simply following the rules laid out to them in law will not get them the longevity they need to make investment decisions. So we use this tool to walk through this kind of thinking and help the host government, from their perspective, understand this is what they should be expecting and really demanding from operators. And now I'm going to hand it over to Joel to discuss how we worked with governments to provide case studies that really highlight real-world examples of everything I've just discussed.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenna. So as my colleagues have mentioned up to this point, the ERGI is really at its core a multilateral organization, one where we learn from our partners' successes in their mining sectors and then use those stories to help inform the global mining community. We've also taken a lot of time to look back into our own history for similar stories with the help of the USGS. At the end of the day, it's these real case studies that have helped us most in informing our initiative, because they're the things that show us these best practices in action and how they can actually manifest in a real mining project. So we're still collecting case studies from our partners, but we've highlighted a couple here that I think really underpin the best practices that we've used to design our toolkit modules. You're already looking at 2 of them right now on the screen here. We're going to talk primarily about geological surveys and then later stewardship a little bit. So we've got 2 geological surveys on the screen right now. These are both prime examples of government bodies that have helped facilitate geoscience and exploration, ensure an open playing field by providing free and public data, and they've been an asset to their country's mining sectors. So both of these organizations are quite old. On the right, you'll see the Geological Survey of Canada, originally founded in 1842. It's actually Canada's oldest scientific agency. And then Geoscience Australia on the left. It's gone through many different iterations. It's had many different names, but its original manifestation was created in 1910, just after Australia's federation. So I've got a couple recent success stories from each of these agencies here. Geoscience Australia has a program called Exploring for the Future, or EFTF, which has invested over $100 million over the last 4 years in promoting geoscience in Northern Australia. The data from this initiative has created a lot of interest from exploration companies. There's been 13 exploration tenements being filed, including probably most prominently Anglo American's exploration of the region near Mount Isa. On the right, Geological Survey of Canada, there's also been many very successful initiatives for them over the last couple decades. I've got 2 here that I've highlighted. One of them is the Targeted Geosciences Initiative, or TGI, that started around the turn of the 21st century, so early 2000s. This is really in response to Canada's surface mineral deposits starting to deplete. So the initiative looked at how to better detect and understand subsurface deposits, and then as those were better understood, how to understand how those subsurface deposits form, so that you could actually better predict where you could find them. So this initiative has really played a big part in maintaining Canada's leadership as a global mining leader. Another major GSC, or Geological Survey of Canada, initiative is the Geomapping for Energy and Minerals, or GEM, the GEM program, which was designed to better understand the resources of Canada's north, which at the time of its inception, the northern Canadian resources were only mapped, about 20% of them were only mapped to modern standards. So the GEM has really expanded the mapping in northern Canada, has resulted in numerous projects, and by extension, infrastructure improvements for northern Canadian inhabitants. So at the bottom line here, you'll see at the bottom of the slide, it's important to highlight free open data is critical to de-risk projects for potential investors. That's what's important. Let's move the slide deck forward. All right, so let's talk about stewardship. So Jenna really hit this well earlier, but I'm going to reiterate here. It's critical to have engagement with local communities is critical for the long-term health of both the project and the population around the project, the population affected by the project. There are plenty of stories across the world where this has gone wrong, and some of those end in tragedy. But I'll take a minute here to highlight some positive stories from both ourselves and partner countries. So let's start with the Red Dog mine on the left. It's one of the world's biggest zinc mines. It also produces lead. It's situated in remote northwestern Alaska, so a United States mine. Red Dog was actually originally enabled by a strong relationship between private explorers and the USGS. So there's a bit of a nice success story there on the exploration side. And now it's a joint project between Canadian miner Teck Resources and the Inupiat Native Corporation, NANA. So the mine has contributed significantly to Alaskan revenue and Native economic opportunities. There's been over $140 million in payment in lieu of taxes to the Northwest Arctic Borough. At the mine itself, over half the staff are Native NANA shareholders. The mine has prioritized things like education, schools, tradition continuity, including hunting and fishing rights for the Native population. So it's a good example of a consistent and thorough social license to operate being obtained by the mine. The example of community engagement that we're highlighting from Australia, again, comes from Geoscience Australia, with its commitment to free, prior, and informed consent of all Native stakeholders for any mining project. We've highlighted here Geoscience Australia's Barkley Seismic Survey, which took place in 2019. Throughout the whole period of this survey, Geoscience Australia consulted with 18 different Aboriginal communities and employed 39 different Aboriginal custodians. So when we talk about social license to operate, this is the kind of engagement that we're looking for, that this is the kind of engagement that we mean when we talk about these kinds of licenses. Working with local communities in a way that everyone can benefit from a project gives that project more staying power and a longer and more productive life. That's kind of the bottom line. All right, let's go to the next slide. So I highlighted this earlier. I briefly touched on this, but I'd like to reiterate it. These best practices that we talk about, really, they're informed by these stories. They're not written in stone anywhere, right? These were not sort of conceived when we first struck a pickaxe into stone, when mining started. This is a living product where we distribute best practices largely as a form of case studies. We totally expect this product, the toolkit, the case studies, to expand both in breadth and in depth in the future, and we really hope that you'll follow along with our progress. So with that, I think the team would really like to thank you. The whole team at the State Department would like to thank you for your participation today. Everybody who's present. We'd like to thank the Institute of the Americas for hosting this. We hope everyone's doing well. We hope everyone's staying safe, and we'll be happy to field any questions. Thanks again.
Definitely have some questions here. Let's start with a really pretty straightforward one from Emily about language for the toolkit and resources that you all have created. Congratulations on that, by the way. Are these available in French or Spanish? Will they be available in other languages?
The toolkit. We're looking into how to deploy into at least those two languages, if not others. So I think that's something that you can expect to see in the coming months, because that's something that we have heard quite a lot about, and there seems to be quite a lot of demand for. So yes, stay tuned.
Excellent. Okay, so English right now, but coming soon, and at least French and Spanish, and maybe other languages. Great, thank you. I'm going to just sort of go through the questions as we receive them, and hopefully we can get through all of the questions. And feel free to continue to pose questions, folks. Thanks everyone for your active participation so far. A question from someone here, Edith, about what about the processing phase? And she says often not very sustainable and even more concentrated than extraction. So maybe somebody on the team wants to comment on where ERGI or ERGI, excuse me, weighs in on the processing phase of minerals.
Oh, sorry, Elena, you go. Oh no, is it just me? All right, this is Jenna again. It's something that we considered, honestly, as we tried to, as Elena said initially, tried to figure out what else was out there. and where we can really add value, we had to draw the box somewhere. And because of a lot of the technical assistance the Bureau provides in this space is upstream focused, upstream became kind of the kind of nexus that we looked at, the where we looked through the address this problem. So it's not just I completely agree. Processing is definitely something we should consider. It's just we had to really bound the problem up front, and so it didn't make its way into this iteration of the toolkit. I will say I see some of these other questions down here. I think this is going to come up because it's asking if we do address some of these other issues. It's difficult to see on this slide, but if you do go to the website, you'll see that underneath there are these grayed out sections. And so this is how we're thinking about moving forward and fleshing out the rest of this toolkit. So it's not necessarily to say we're going to commit to all of these, but I could see potentially adding something like processing under the production stage, perhaps, or for future iterations of the toolkit. But we had to pick like one thing each to launch with, and so these are the areas we picked. And now as we are going through the next iteration of the toolkit, we're picking more modules. And so it's helpful to see that there's interest in some of these areas like processing and recycling, because I think it's good to hear from you what's needed. But yes.
Okay, no, fair enough. So it's a work. I mean, it's something that's organic and living and will continue to evolve and develop. So I think that's important to understand. Thank you. Let me roll up a couple of questions here from Jamil and from Jesse about the U.S. And sort of which of the tools that the United States does really, which of the tools, excuse me, does the United States do really well in its mining sector? And is there something that the United States needs to work on to address the challenges in the mining sector? And the reason I want to blend it with Jesse's is because Jesse, who by the way will be presenting this Thursday, so tune in for further thoughts from him. But he's arguing that the U.S., or he says one could argue that the U.S. has a third world record of mineral right ownerships for areas of the U.S. where land is private. Could the U.S. create a national registry of mineral rights? So some questions about the United States in terms of the toolkit, in terms of tools that you looked at, or the ERGI could look at for the toolkit, and sort of where does the U.S. fit into this in terms of informing the broader idea and initiative?
Yeah, I think that we have a very strong geological survey. I think that's really well understood. The USGS has a really long history of serving the mining community and the extractives community in general really well domestically. I do think ERGI is an international initiative, a multilateral initiative where we're primarily looking outside of our borders. So I think maybe the question of where we could improve or what kind of tools we should be looking at for ourselves, a lot of the tools that we've shown here are really educated by what we've done in the past. So I think that, something like the Department of Interior would probably have a really good view on a question like that. I don't know, Mark or Jenna, if you guys want to add anything, or Helena, if you're here.
Thanks, Joel. This is Mark. I think your answer's spot on. Fundamentally, at the Department of State, we're focused on international cooperation, and we always look to the United States to provide an excellent example of good governance and good regulations. But fundamentally, our work is focused on how the United States can cooperate with its allies and partners and friends.
Excellent. Well, and then I'll use that as a way to plug, in fact, the next two webinars in this series of ours, and indeed Jesse Edmondson will speak a little bit. So Jesse, be prepared to fill in a little bit on that. And then, as a matter of fact, right now the final installment of this series will be with the representative Nadal Nasser, who is a chief at the National Minerals Information Center at the United States Geological Survey. So I encourage folks who are posing those questions to join us for those latter two webinars so we can get a little bit more into that. But let's move on to something. I think that there's a couple of interesting questions here. Let's take recycling first. Does the toolkit address recycling? And this is something I think you see come up a lot in this critical minerals discussion, the role of recycling. So any thoughts from the team on the role of recycling and how the toolkit addresses that?
I'd be happy to take that one.
Okay.
You're better at
Yeah,
that.
this is Joel. Yeah, so the toolkit does not currently cover recycling. However, recycling is something that we are very closely watching, the circular economy of energy minerals and of minerals, mechanisms that recycling can contribute to our critical mineral needs, especially energy mineral needs. This is something that we are speaking with DOE about, Department of Energy. They have a really strong recycling program called RECELL, RECELL. And we're planning future ERGI events, and we're really looking forward to making recycling part of a cornerstone of those events. So this is probably going to come more and more into our the center of our vision as we move forward. It's also worth noting that our partner countries as well as ourselves have really lobbied to include language around recycling when we talk about the ERGI. So this is definitely something we're following, that we're talking about, and that is very important to the ERGI. It is not currently included in the toolkit, however. As Jenna hit before, this is very much a living document, living product.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I think we got into recycling a little bit in the first webinar as well. So it's something I think we're all working on and trying to understand better where it fits. Thank you. Another very specific question about the toolkit. Does the toolkit provide emissions inventory calculators for mining processing operations? Anyone have on the team want to weigh in on that?
That was not how the intent of the tool. I think there are other great tools out there that attempt to do that, and we were not looking to kind of duplicate work that's already been done. So this is primarily a governance toolkit, and so emissions tracking is not something we're looking at.
Perfect. Okay. So a question here about oil price and where that fits in. So let's take that and see. In particular, when it talks about low oil prices, it's regarding the issue of lithium demand. So the question is the impact of low oil price. Does a low oil price push out the more immediate need for lithium and other minerals as EV cost parity is pushed back? So this is a pretty broad but important question that we get into now with low prices, and apparently low prices for considerable amount of time in this year. What impact does that have on the demand side, or the role of the mineral demand in this case? The questions about electric vehicles, but we can talk more generally about critical minerals.
Yeah, thanks. Go ahead and take my question. I appreciate the importance of the question and the importance in the short and medium term of low oil prices to EV demand. But what we're doing with this initiative is really taking quite a long view of demand. So we do still think that critical energy mineral demand will increase and increase exponentially in the coming years. Whether that'll be pushed out a little bit by very low oil prices, I think that's still really an open question. I don't think that we in the State Department are really qualified to answer that. I think there are really wonderful analysts out there, analysts who we talk to and who we do our best to maintain an excellent relationship with, who inform our initiative, who could probably speak better to the question of pricing and how oil prices affect the prices for critical energy minerals. But we really take a long view on this stuff. We don't see trend. We don't see the trend of critical energy mineral demand strengthening as changing. So I think fundamentally we're still viewing that demand as growing, and that it will grow in the coming years and decades. So what we're really interested in is ensuring that there are more and more sources of these supplies, and that the supply chains for those minerals are more resilient. and also that the investment climate in a variety of different countries is better through the strengthening of governance and the strengthening of regulations in the extractive sector.
Perfect. So here's an interesting question, and the question is specifically about how ERGI, or how this initiative, articulates or I guess integrates with USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, particularly in terms of fostering energy cooperation. So that's one of Roberto's first questions. I would ask you guys in your response to broaden that. Again, you've explained how the Bureau of Energy Resources at the Department of State is in terms of the foreign policy objectives of energy in the United States. So where does this initiative fit in terms of, let's say, foreign assistance, particularly vis-a-vis energy development and extractive development?
Sure, thanks, Jeremy. And if my colleagues want to interject, I would be happy for them to contribute as well. Fundamentally here, what we're doing is creating a dialogue among the governments of a variety of countries. And we've, most of our meetings have been on the margins of larger meetings that government officials attend in order to speak about governance and regulation, and to come to an agreement about some of the best practices and some of the best practices that countries can learn from and can contribute to a dialogue on extractive policy. So in terms of foreign assistance, while we do think that we could in the future do some technical workshops, I think that the initiative itself is more about fostering dialogue in a diplomatic setting rather than how we would view foreign assistance in the traditional sense.
I'll interject. Okay. As this is Jenna. I am a program manager for our bureau, and so technical assistance and fostering technical assistance and managing it is something that I work on daily. We cooperate quite closely with USAID all over the world, depending on the mission. And I think one of the things that I've seen in my work is that a lot of the work USAID is doing in some of the countries we work, where we have foreign assistance in this area, is it tends to be focused on artisanal small-scale mining, which I think gets to one of the questions I see down here as well. And that's not traditionally, as I said, an area we have worked. We've tended to work more in upstream. And so while we coordinate very closely with our colleagues there, and there's many interagency coordination meetings, but it's not an area where we have traditionally overlapped a lot. And so it hasn't been an area. And as this is more of a governance toolkit, and as Mark said, we're really trying to use this. It's not meant to inform our technical assistance, but it's meant to potentially be used by our technical assistants if it made sense down the road.
Yeah, I think one of you all described this as a multilateral platform, so I think that continues to be a good way to think about it. And you mentioned and earlier in the slides the international partners in this, so that's important. Before we jump, because there is that question on artisanal, let's take Roberto's second question just quickly. So I think the synthesis of this question is that ERGI will indeed be focused on critical minerals instead of oil and gas. Is that a fair? How would you answer that question?
That's completely this initiative is only focused on mining.
Right. Okay. So you're right that there is this question about artisanal mining, and I think it's an interesting question as we get into the stakeholder engagement, the social license to operate element, and so what's being referred to here is how this initiative will ensure that FPIC, free and prior informed consent, and other consult-based consultation processes are truly implemented in good faith. The questioner, Benjamin, goes on to talk a little bit about, and everyone can read here some of his comments on on the role of indigenous communities and critical mineral endowments. But talk, because this really gets at the heart of what you all lay out here. In fact, on the screen we have the cross-cutting stewardship theme bucket. Maybe whoever wants to jump in and talk a little bit more how that blends with indeed this indigenous specific free and prior informed consent, consulta previa as we call it in Latin America.
Oh yeah, actually, there seems to be an echo. I actually would like to reconsider my answer previously, because while this toolkit is focused on mining, I think broadly ERGI as an initiative within the Bureau is focused on the energy transition, and the energy transition does obviously include oil and gas trends broadly within the market, right? That's one of the things fueling the transition. So I guess you could say that oil and gas is considered as part of the broader initiative, that broadly, but this toolkit is not. I hope those are kind of distinct.
Okay.
But in terms of consultas previas and those, one of the ways that we have, and this became very important and clear to us when we were talking to our partner governments in Canada and Australia, where this idea of Indigenous rights are very, very important, and they wanted us to highlight, these issues, is if you go into this social license to operate section, we talk about this idea of a triple bottom line, which I think everyone is familiar with, but it has evolved in a way to almost be a quadruple bottom line to some of these governments, where Indigenous consultation is its own its own pillar. And so that's something that we highlighted there as within that tool as well. I think the way that we thought about Indigenous rights and consultas previas was broader. It wasn't specific to Indigenous peoples. It was more, the idea of prior informed consent broadly, which was what we tried to get at in terms of what are the best practices for that and social license to operate. So I'll say we don't have a section specific to Indigenous rights. We have a section that's specific to prior informed consent and consultations in general. And if you go through the social license to operate tool, I think you could dig into this content a little more. But it's good to hear. I mean, this is obviously something, as someone who works in Latin America and elsewhere, this is a huge issue. And it was in the back of our minds as we approached the development of this toolkit. We just wanted to try to make the governance topics as broad as possible. And so this idea of how do you engage a community versus how do you engage specifically an Indigenous community, we did not parse it to that extent.
Yeah, no, it gets very complex very fast in every country, depending upon how they incorporate the ISO or the ILO, excuse me, ILO law into their constitution. Then there's specifics how they manage, because there is a huge difference between the Indigenous consulta previa and what's more broadly the social license. So, but thank you for illuminating a little bit. And just, I think you answered this, but just to give you the chance to reconfirm or reiterate your answer about artisanal mining, and that this toolkit or ERGI more broadly does not necessarily deal with artisanal mining, just to make sure we had that clear from you.
There are lessons here that apply to both large scale and small scale production, but it does not specifically address artisanal small scale mining. No.
Okay. Yeah. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Okay. Cool. So I'm trying to roll through. We've got a lot of questions here, and there's some comments. Thanks, folks, for jumping in and adding your thoughts here on some of these things we've been talking about. There's a question here, and I'm trying to find it, about the North American, I guess, profile. And I apologize for. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
I can hear you, Jeremy.
Okay, super. Just want to make sure. Can ERGI be a precursor for a North American integrated cross-border value chain? And this is something that came up in a webinar we did a couple of weeks ago as well. I think sort of the idea of the importance of these critical minerals and the importance of not just in this initiative, but overall as part of the energy transition. Is there something that North America, this questioner, Jamil here, talks about U.S. and Canada, but maybe we could even throw Mexico into this as well. I mean, there's so much cooperation historically on obviously free trade and on now more recently energy. Is there a possibility for a North American integrated cross-border value chain? Does that? I know that's maybe getting a bit outside the bounds of this, but any thoughts on that from the team?
Hey, Jeremy, I'll go ahead and take a first stab at that. I think that that's something that would be a little bit presumptuous if if we were able to say that the State Department could create that kind of an initiative. Certainly, we'd like to see broader diversity of sources of supply in critical energy minerals and more resilient supply chains, and obviously, the more trade that happens among countries, whether it be in North America or throughout the world, I think the more trade that we see, the better. But I think in terms of creating specific initiative like that, I think that would be really an interagency.
Absolutely.
We'll expect a memo to the secretary on that from you, Mark. Okay.
I think it would have to be a memo to the president.
Excellent. Anyone else want to? I think that probably. But if anyone else wants to jump in, well, I want to try and give you all a chance to respond to anything that we've talked about so far, and I know there's several of you on here. So if anyone didn't have the chance to jump in as we wrap up here, Mark and the team, thank you all again so much. And I don't know if Morgan, if you had any questions you wanted to jump in on, but otherwise, I'll throw it over to Mark and his team for any final thoughts that they'd like to share with us as we wrap up. And thanks again for your time. This has been great. Any final thoughts, Mark and the team?
Yeah. One thing I did see a question in regard to cooperation with the IGF, and I'd like to just talk a little bit about our cooperation with other organizations in general, just if we could. So we do maintain a dialogue with the private sector, with non-governmental organizations, and with organizations such as the IGF or the World Bank's Climate Smart Mining Facility.
The IGF is, okay, I'm sorry, right, the International...
Sorry, it's the Intergovernmental Forum.
Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, got it, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we've been going to meetings and maintaining a dialogue with a variety of stakeholders, the IGF among them, and then a variety of other organizations that I mentioned earlier. So we really do view those organizations as a critical component to our initiative, and organizations that we look to inform the initiative and to get ideas, and just to ensure that our thinking is in tune with sort of the world standard in terms of governance and regulation of the extractive sector. So I just wanted to underscore that that we do try to maintain an open dialogue with a variety of stakeholders in the extractive sector.
No, that's perfect. And actually, let me jump in there because it's something that I had on my mind, but now you've reminded me to pose it, and we've talked around it, but not specifically or too explicitly, the role of the private sector. So maybe if you or someone else wants to spend a minute on where the private sector, obviously you've talked about some of the lessons and some of the case studies, but more specifically the engagement just as you got done speaking about sort of the other inter and non-governmental actors. What about the private sector?
Sure. So, you know, we look to the private sector, obviously, to provide the necessary investment to make these minerals and metals economically viable. So, you know, when we talk about the regulation and the governance aspects that are necessary to ensure a good investment climate, we really look to the private sector to inform some of our thinking in how to get there. So we have definitely reached out to companies and asked them, you know, what would you like to see done better around the world in terms of extractive governance? What do you look for when making an investment decision? And I think a lot of those conversations, the outcomes of a lot of those conversations are certainly reflected in this first iteration of the toolkit. And certainly as we roll out more modules and make flesh the toolkit out a little bit, there'll certainly be more, you know, best practices and lessons learned there from the private sector's perspective.
Perfect. Anyone else have any final thoughts on Helena, Jenna, Joel?
Just grateful for everyone to participate today.
Yeah, and I really appreciate everyone's questions and comments are helpful as we think through kind of what the next iteration of the toolkit looks like and which modules and which tools we select next to build out. And just want to underscore that this is an iterative process. This is a live kind of toolkit, and so we will be working on it throughout the course of the year. So please continue to check back. Yeah, and thank you very much.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Institute of the Americas and the Payne Institute. Really, really appreciate your support and allowing us to be on this platform. We really appreciate it, and look forward to continuing our cooperation in the future.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Mark and Helena, Jenna, and Joel, for your time, and thanks everyone. We really appreciate it, and we'll make sure we download all the commentary questions on the chat and share that with you all. To your point of informing the continued development of the ERGI. I don't know why I want to call it ERGI, but I guess ERGI. As you said, you get a pay increase for that acronym, so good, congrats on that. Hope you all get that as well. Thanks so much to the Bureau of Energy Resources, Department of State. We appreciate your time today. Thanks everyone for joining us online. We'll see you again on Thursday morning for the next installment, as you see on the screen here. The future of clean energy demands critical mineral policy solutions. So I think we'll get much more into exactly how the nexus of critical minerals and energy transition are developing. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you all. Have a wonderful day. Stay healthy, and best wishes.